This is Athens Speakout. My name is Robert Whealey. I am technically 88 years old, but I'll soon be 89. And I'm probably the oldest historian in Athens, although maybe Drew is a little older.
Yes, indeed. She's 90 already.
Yeah, Drew then. Drew Everett. Now you want to speak?
Oh, sure. I'm Lois Whealey, the other half of the Whealey family. And I have my own program about women, but I'm very glad to be a guest on your program, your Speak Out program, Bob.
Thank you very much.
And I did want to point out the way in which the Baker Peace Conference this year was advertised. There was a booklet about it and a poster. And this
It's called the Temple of Peace. Go ahead.
Yes, the Temple of Peace.
With a question mark.
And it shows Uncle Sam holding up the world.
Okay.
And the subtitle is International Cooperation and World Order since 1945. It was held last week here, and they've been doing Baker Peace Conferences for quite a few years. Bob and I almost always get to them. And we thought it would be good to share the things that were said, some of the different people that came. There was an evening event, which Bob will tell you about. And then the following day, which was a Friday, there were workshops. Unfortunately, the workshops weren't too well attended. Of course, most of the students were busily taking courses, I think. But it was held at Nelson Commons. And Bob, will you tell us a little bit about the Thursday evening program?
Okay. Admiral James Stavridis was the keynote speaker. And he divided the world into hard power and soft power. That is a different way of looking at the world from myself. I go back to the Constitution of the United States, which was drafted in City Hall, Philadelphia, by Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson,
John Adams, and John Quincy Adams, and before John Quincy, of course.
Okay, there were six people who understood the balance of power. The balance of power is the key to understanding history. And my PhD was based on the balance of power. Now, actually, everyone has a religion, and they are either born Jewish, or Protestant, or Roman Catholic. And the Protestants had about 8 or 9 well-known different sects, you know, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, and so on. So anyway, you begin with your mother and father. Everybody has a mother and father who inherit prejudices. Well, my father was raised in a Methodist environment, and he was opposed to Catholicism. He thought the idea of Roman Catholicism, the victor of Christ, was a form of dictatorship, and he used to Hitler was then in power. They used to say, Franco, he was from Spain, and Hitler said, Adolf Hitler is the master race, and Benito Mussolini. These were the three big dictators who were on the eve of the Second World War, okay?
And of course, Stalin was in the Soviet Union at
All
that
right,
time,
but the United
too.
States and Britain had to ally with Stalin in order to defeat Adolf Hitler.
Right, because he had overrun Europe, Western Europe,
Yes,
and was attacking the Soviet Union
right.
by 1940.
Okay, fine.
We were young folks then.
Well, actually, he attacked the Soviet Union in 1939.
Okay,
1940 was an election in the United States.
yes.
And my father was an isolationist from the First World War.
He served in France during World War I,
That's
didn't
right.
he, Bob?
That's right. And he came out of the First World War as an isolationist. And he tried to protect me from going into the Second World War. I was no military hero.
Of course,
Okay.
you were too young to serve in the Second World War. We were both, well, in 1945, when the war ended,
They dropped the atomic bomb.
I was in 8th grade
Right.
that year.
And I was 15.
So you were already, had begun
Right.
high school.
Right. Okay.
But we do remember those times, and we certainly remember the, what is it now, something like 55 years since 1945.
Okay.
Maybe
So,
my math is off.
all right, well, getting back now to Stavridis. He sees the world entirely different. He is an admiral, of course, and he divides the world into hard power and soft power.
Okay,
And he holds up this globe, Uncle Sam,
Uncle Sam's
is,
holding the globe.
is United Nations. That's soft power. And then there's NATO, and that is soft power. That's an alliance, but you notice there are little cracks down in the bottom of the thing. NATO is being undermined by the President Trump. And the United States will be lucky to survive the dictatorship, the potential dictatorship of Donald Trump, who has no idea of intelligence or the State Department and believes that he is the most brilliant man in the world. He knows more about the State Department than the State Department does. He knows more about the military than the military. And he has a philosophy based on the 7 deadly sins.
Well, I think we should see a picture of Admiral Stavridis.
Okay, he'll flash that on there. There it
Yes.
is. Okay,
He was the speaker on Thursday night
Good.
before those workshops were held
fine.
on Friday last week.
Right.
And you see he's an admiral. The picture doesn't show his rows and rows and rows of medals, but
He was in his, he was soft power.
he was soft power in
He
the
was
side.
talking about soft power.
Okay.
Hard
right.
power is is an admiral who goes out there and uses the. We have an admiral, and we have Annapolis. We have West Point. West Point is for the men.
The
Army.
Army men.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Officers.
Right.
Officer training.
So the United States, like all powers, have to have a military. Nobody is for unilateral disarmament. That's totally utopia. Okay. So go ahead.
Well, were you going to say specifically more details on what Stavridis had to say?
Okay. Stavridis believes in hard power and soft power.
Both, yes.
And hard power is military force. And the United States has to have an Annapolis where people are trained to be admirals, on West Point where they're trained to be generals. And then we have a new Air Force Academy out in Colorado, but that didn't exist in 1945. That was made after they developed the Pentagon. The Pentagon was five shaped building, which came out of World War II, okay?
Yes, it's a huge building. It's,
Right,
It's got rings. I mean,
right.
rings.
So he's a relatively pacifist general, in which he'll admit that people who work in soft power, like Lois and my daughter Alice, and librarians, and school teachers, and the Red Cross, and they also serve. They serve the American people in the civilian theater. Okay. So that's how we divide. Okay. Now, you want to talk? Do you want me to continue to talk about Brobst?
Well,
That would be my next.
okay. Yes, you gave the main point that you got from Admiral Stavridis's
Okay.
talk on Thursday.
Well-
and then now we will go more into the workshops that were held
okay.
Friday
Yes.
during the daytime.
Well, John Brobst he came to Ohio University and was recruited to replace me. I was just retiring when he came as a young man. And he then has a, gotta have a magnifying glass here.
Oh, well, while Bob searches for glasses, I'll mention that
Here.
we came to Athens in 1964,
Okay.
and Bob was recruited to Athens History Department
Okay.
here at Ohio University
Okay.
by John Cady, who was a specialist on Burma in the
Right.
Far
And
East.
he was an anti-imperialist. And
Yes.
John Cady and I were opposed to imperialism.
Yeah, and you were both opposed to the Vietnam War, which
Absolutely.
was going on at that time,
The
actually.
Vietnam War is the first war the United States lost. And it is the mirror image of World War II. So anyway, getting back to Brobst, he is now an associate professor at Ohio University, and he has courses in the British Empire, geopolitics, and naval history. And his degree came from University of Kansas, and then he got a degree from University of Texas. And his big thesis is the future of the grand game. Sir Olaf Crane, India's defense of Asia. So the grand game is another name for the balance of power, but it's limited to the subcontinent of India, okay, where the balance of power is European-centered. And we've always had a balance of power between the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, and I inherited the idea of balance of power when I did my PhD, and my thesis was a rather original thesis. The standard interpretation is that World War II broke out in 1939 when Neville Chamberlain, the appeasing Prime Minister of Britain, who did not want a Second World War because he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he had the simple idea that that Britain did not have the money for a Second World War. But anyway, Winston Churchill and Lord Halifax pushed him from the back, and he said, "You must declare war on Hitler, or we will resign." So anyway, Neville Chamberlain then said the war broke out in Germany when Hitler invaded Poland, and he and the French were going to defend Poland, but they had to have assistance from the Russian Empire in the East because the French wanted to finance Russia so that Germany would be forced to fight a two-front war. So
yes.
that is the balance of power, as it was interpreted by both Probst and myself.
Yeah, it was, and we vaguely remember the Second World War, but we were in grade school at the time that it started.
Okay. Now, you want to talk about some of these other people here?
Well, certainly there were other people who were involved with the workshops.
Give their thesis.
And, well, I don't know that I can give all of their theses.
Well, get the highlight. I was impressed with Alma O'Malley, okay? And then I thought Stephen Metz was the worst historian on the program. I disagreed with practically everything he said.
Well, Dr. Metz teaches at the U.S. Army War College,
Yes.
actually.
Yes.
Which is, that's different from West Point, isn't it, Bob?
No, it's the
The
West
War
Point
College.
is the official. The
And-
War College is down in Washington.
It's in D.C.
That's right.
Okay.
It's a center in Washington D.C. And his book is called Strategic Institute of the. That's the name of his
Yes.
The U.S. Army War College is called the U.S. Army College of Strategic Studies. That's the official name. SSI, okay? And then it says that he holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a PhD, and he served under Henry L. Stimson. He served as the Henry L. Stimson's professor. Well, who is Henry L. Stimson? He's a very important person.
Yes, so that's another name that we remember from our long ago past.
Okay, Teddy Roosevelt retired in Nassau County.
New York, yes.
Yes.
But now he was long ago. He was
First World War.
president before the First
Yes,
World
that's
War.
right.
Yeah.
And Stimson then was a soldier in World War II in the Far East. Okay, and they had Roosevelt had a good European policy, but he did not know much about Asia, and his Asian policy was based on getting Republican votes. So Roosevelt was interventionist in Europe, but isolationist toward Asia. The Republican Party was just reverse under General MacArthur. He was an interventionist in Asia and predicted that the next war would be with Japan.
And it turned out that was the case.
Well, there was a two-front war, but
Yes.
anyway, he then volunteered to serve in the Philippine Army and protect the Philippines as an independent state. And he anticipated that Japan would attack the Philippines. He did not have any idea that the Japanese would go all the way to Pearl Harbor. He didn't think they were that powerful.
To the Hawaiian Islands.
Yeah, that's the big controversy.
And
Did
that-
Roosevelt, who was a naval man,
He was. He had a big hobby of
that's right.
naval.
But did he have a plot to get the Japanese to bomb the obsolete battleships in Pearl Harbor while the aircraft carriers were out to sea? Was that just an accident, or was that a deliberate conspiracy?
Well, there are a few people who hold that.
Lots of people hold that.
But,
lots of people hold that.
But I personally don't. But then I was a big fan of President Roosevelt.
Well, Churchill was behind this. Churchill had a private correspondence with Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Called the First Admiral. So when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Churchill was in glee. We're not going to lose the war.
Well, that certainly brought the United States into the war.
That's right.
When
It was
he
the end of
attacked.
isolationism.
when he attacked Pearl Harbor, when
Right.
they attacked Pearl Harbor
Right.
on December 7th, 1941.
A day that will live in infamy.
Infamy, right. That's
Right.
what FDR said the next day when he
And I heard,
called
I heard
Congress
that
to declare
address
war.
when I was in the 6th grade. My 6th grade teacher said, I'm going to give you an extra 20 minutes for your recess, but I want everybody in his seat at 1 a.m., and she had the radio there.
Oh,
And she would
on
say,
December 7th.
he said, you will remember this radio. And I did.
Yeah. Well, I was a little younger, so I don't really. I do remember the headlines.
Okay.
You know, huge headlines
Right.
about war in December 1941.
Right. Okay.
Yes. Well, you've mentioned Dr. Brobst. He was the moderator for one of the workshops that was held.
Well, he was a moderator for all of them.
On Friday.
he was-
Well, he was not the official moderator.
He introduced all of the other people. He was the
intro-
senior man at Athens.
Okay, but what I'm
These
saying
other people,
is,
Lears and Metz and Nolan, were guests.
what I'm saying is that
Okay, go ahead.
he was the moderator specifically to introduce the people at the 1 o'clock afternoon meeting on
And
last
also in the
Friday.
morning. He was there in AM and PM. He was there
Okay.
all day.
Oh, yes, he was there all day.
All right,
But
so-
actually, the Cold War framework was moderated by Dr. Seth Givens, who was with the U.S. Marine Corps Historian's Office.
All right, do you want to talk about the Cold War and Gibbons?
No.
You don't. Well, you know I don't like the term Cold War.
Yes, I know.
I will elaborate. The Korean War was a real war. It
Ah.
broke out in 1950, and it was over in 1953.
But
A
it's-
war has specific dates.
Yes, it does. However,
All right.
there
Well,
was
you want
never
to argue before I even get my thesis out. Go ahead. I gave you the platform. You telling me what you think about the Cold War,
Oh.
and then I will tell you what I think about it.
No, I don't want to.
All right.
talk
Do anything you
about
want.
That.
You're the boss.
Well-
Go ahead. Talk. The Cold War is a metaphor.
It's a metaphor because it refers to the great competition and dislike, or whatever you want to call it, between Russia, formerly the Soviet Union,
Right.
and the United States.
Fine.
They never actually got to a shooting war, thank God. But there was this so-called Cold War because there was this intense competition and dislike between the United States and the Soviet Union and later
Okay.
Russia itself.
Well, as a historian, I talk about the balance of power and real wars. And the Cold War was a metaphor which, in other words, I disagree with all of the speakers were talking about the Cold War throughout the period,
Well,
but they
that's-
had different ideas of when the Cold War began, but they all implied that the Cold War was over.
Uh-huh.
They all admit that there's no more Cold War.
Well, I'm not sure that it's actually over, but it's certainly not as hot a Cold War as it was
Okay.
after 1945
Okay.
and until
Well, we had a great
perhaps
great
2016.
debate on modifying the amendment, the balance of power. You said that because Hillary lost, we should modify the Constitution. And I say no, the Constitution should stand exactly the way it was written by John Adams Benjamin Franklin,
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, and John Quincy Adams, the first 5 presidents. Okay. And I want everybody to have in their pocket the Bill of Rights and the outline of the American Constitution and be able to speak about that every day. And that's how you get rid of Trump. Then
Unfortunately, we don't have one of those in our pockets.
I'm putting one in my
currently.
pocket, and I advise myself and you to put one in my pocket, and I will put that in my pocket as soon as I talk to Judy Dazo. But Judy Dazo has to get me on the phone, and I have to put the 10 Commandments on there. Do you know who Judy Dazo is?
Oh, I certainly know who she is, but I think
I don't have it in my pocket today.
That's right.
But I'm going to put it in my pocket.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
And I'm going to be speaking about that until I'm 100 and die.
Well, right now, why don't we talk a little bit more
About
about the Baker
Okay,
Peace
go ahead.
Conference?
Go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned Dr. Brost, but there were several people in the afternoon session.
All right.
One of the interesting speakers had a good deal to say about Australia.
Yes, that's right.
I think that maybe that was, was it
Australia
Dr.
is
Settlemeyer?
No, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
The point was that Australia is a subcontinent, and she's an expert on Australia, and the British decided they were no longer going to defend Australia. They were going to concentrate on NATO and the Euro and Europe.
Right,
And
NATO.
the Australians were on their own.
Right,
And the United States and New Zealand formed an alliance called ANZUS. And the
which
United
is sort of like NATO.
Yeah, and they were protecting
Only for the
Australia.
Pacific.
Yeah, they were protecting Australia from a possible Japanese invasion. But the Japanese do not have the ability to invade, and the Japanese became under Tokyo, under MacArthur, became taken over by the United States.
Yes, because they lost the Second World War.
They lost the Second World War. But the Far Eastern policy of Roosevelt was somewhat of an afterthought. He was not an expert on China. And the Republicans were imperialistic in the China theater. Okay, that's the so-called Cold War.
Yeah. Well, the Philippines were certainly involved
They were
in the
possession.
Pacific
They were
War.
taken over by Admiral Dewey.
Yes, and that was back at about the year 1900, a little
Right.
before the 1900, in the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, in other words, Roosevelt was a Rough Rider. He was going to go to
Theodore
Cuba.
Roosevelt
He
we're
was going to
talking
go.
about now.
Theodore Roosevelt was going to go down, and he served under the Hearst Press. And he said, "I'm going to be a Rough Rider, and I'm going to liberate Cuba from the evil Spanish Empire."
Yes, the
And
Philippines.
as soon as he did it, that they made Cuba an American protectorate and satellite, because all of the sugar and all of the income, in other words, Cuba became an American protectorate.
Yes.
Okay.
Following the Spanish-American War, which
Okay.
was a very brief war, which
Very brief.
began in April, like all the other American wars,
So-
until World War
So
II.
Teddy Roosevelt was a contradiction. He was a trust buster on the Standard Oil,
Yes.
and at the same time, he was an imperialist in Latin America.
Yes. And in the Far East, the Philippines,
He extended it.
as you pointed out, was taken over by Admiral Dewey.
Right.
Did you know, Bob, that my stepfather was named for
I
him?
can believe that.
George Dewey.
That's right.
He was born about that same time. He
Right.
was born in
Your
1899.
family was far more military than my family.
Well,
My mother and father knew nothing about the military.
okay, I'm not
Until
too sure about the military. He was one of the younger children of the elder Washburns, and
Right.
like I say, because he was born in 1899, right after the victory in the Spanish-American War. He was named for George Dewey.
Right.
George Dewey Washburn was his name. A very nice fellow.
Okay, fine.
But far away, I'm afraid, from
Okay,
the
go ahead.
Temple of Peace and International Cooperation and World Order since
Okay.
1945. But we were talking about Dr. Settlemyre, who was the one who
All right. Carry
talked
on.
about
Settle mine.
Australia.
Right. Now, I more or less explained what I thought of Settlemyre. She had a good thesis, and I thought it was well done. Australia was on its own. Now, do you have anything, do you agree with that, or do you have something more to say about Settlemyre?
No, not really. It was, we don't, perhaps because we are in the northern hemisphere and Australia is in the southern hemisphere and far, far away across the Pacific, the South Pacific, I scarcely ever think of Australia, although I've had friends and family members who have been there.
John Burnham went to Australia.
John Burnham went to Australia. He was a college friend of mine at Stanford and also a history major there. And then he taught at Ohio State University for many years. He taught history.
And he recently died.
But he died a couple of years ago now.
Was it a couple of years ago?
Yeah, yeah. He was an American intellectual historian. That was his field. A little less of an international interest, certainly, than
He was
than
not
yours.
interested in politics. That he said he was a scientific social historian.
Yes, he wrote on the history of medicine and
Right.
America in general, and intellectual history, as you point out. Our late friend, John Burnham. Well, we're farther away from the Temple of Peace still.
Well,
With our friend
I would.
Burnham.
I think. Do you want to say anything more about O'Malley? Because I think she was the most impressive.
Dr. Alana O'Malley.
Yes.
She was she teaches at Leiden University, which is in the Netherlands. In other words, she teaches in Europe. So she's more of a specialist in that area. I did take some notes on her
Okay.
speech. I think she was the one who had a lot of good slides.
All right.
She had slides that emphasized her main points, and she also had slides that illustrated some of the things that were happening.
Was this Settlemyre's slide? Learn Russian? Who's that? Who put that slide out?
That was Ambassador Jennifer Brush.
Okay.
She was another person who was,
Read Russian. And
yes.
she wanted to learn,
She
get everybody to read
emphasized that.
Russian as part of the soft power necessary
she was one of the...
to compete with Russia on an intellectual plane.
she was in the workshop at 3 o'clock.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas Dr. O'Malley of Leiden University was on the workshop at 1 o'clock.
Okay.
And she had, as I say, slides. One of the interesting slides that she showed was Khrushchev.
Yes.
Of Khrushchev of the Soviet Union
All
at
right.
a United Nations event. Got so upset at something that was being said that he took off his shoe and banged it on the
Okay.
table. And that was the picture that she showed of Premier Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table at the United
Well, that
Nations.
was a kind of an American propaganda against Soviet Union.
Oh, yes. Americans were really shocked by
I
that.
believe in George Orwell.
Yeah.
All politicians are propagandists, and they peddle their own message. And
Propaganda is it's a tough thing.
it was invented by the Pope. The propagation of the faith.
Right. Propaganda comes from propagation of
And
the
Hitler
faith.
had a ministry of propaganda.
Yes, he certainly
The
did.
Americans and the British never had a ministry of propaganda.
Well, no.
They came out with the Ministry of Public Information. And they allowed all sides to, BBC was a better program than American advertisement. ABC, NBC were all financed by advertisement. BBC was a public broadcast system.
Yes, it's
And their BBC was credible secretly in Germany. People had short wave set, and of course Hitler, if he caught anybody listening to it, the Gestapo would arrest them.
yeah.
Okay.
Send them off to a concentration
Okay,
camp.
but the famous Anne Frank got messages through the underground from BBC, and she could predict that the war would soon be over. She was captive in Holland.
Yes, she was sent to concentration camp there. But I wanted to comment on propaganda.
Go ahead.
I think I learned early that propaganda was something you had to watch out for very
Absolutely,
much.
absolutely.
And the reason I
Loose
did
lips sank ships.
well that, but the thing was that in 1945, our main allies were Britain, France, Russia, China, and we were fighting.
Wait a minute, China. You mean Chiang Kai-shek?
I mean China in
Nationalist.
1945, nationalist China.
Okay,
Yes,
that's a different than Mao Zedong.
yes, definitely.
Okay, there was a
But-
civil war going on in China.
Yeah, and the communists eventually won in 1948.
Right.
But that was the point, that in 1945, Russia and China were our big allies,
Yes.
along with the British and French.
Right.
Now, in 1950,
It reversed itself.
it reversed itself. The people who had been our enemies in
In nationalist
1945
terms.
are,
Purely national terms. Nationality.
well,
Ethnic
the
terms.
people who had been our allies in 1945, China and Russia, had become our enemies.
Right.
Their governments had become communist governments.
That's right.
And the Cold War was on. The United States was having Cold War problems with Soviet Union and communist China by 1950.
Well, if the United States invented the metaphor Cold War, it was the Russians who didn't believe in the Cold War.
Well, it could be.
But they eventually, that was American propaganda to denounce Russia.
Well,
A metaphor.
yes, it was a metaphor for the,
Because when the war was over, the United States Didn't need Chiang Kai-shek. Didn't need.
Well,
They called it Formosa then. And Truman said, we're going to put the fleet in the Formosa Straits to keep Chiang Kai-shek from re-invading the mainland. He can't win. The Dodgen Islands, you remember that?
yeah, that was also to keep the communist Chinese from invading Formosa, where the nationalist
That's right.
Chinese had set up exile government.
That's right.
Yeah,
But the word Formosa is Portuguese. It's called the Beautiful Island. And it's called Taiwan in Chinese.
yes.
It's the island of Taiwan.
So what we called Formosa long ago, when Japan, they had seized it from China
That's right.
back about 1900.
Yeah, and they called it Karafutu in Japanese.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they renamed it. In Japanese. They were going to annex that forever.
Well, the people who were there were not too not too keen on all these foreign names for their island.
Okay. So as you know, there are many dynasties in China. About
Yes.
7 big ones. The Qin dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, so forth.
Well, the Qing was the latest of the dynasties.
Also called Manchu.
Also called, because the Manchurian people, who are different from the Chinese, had invaded in 1911 and taken over China.
Right.
And so, and there was a time when that place was called Manchukuo. That's where the
Manchukuo, that's the...
Kuo, yes, that's
that was
where
the Japanese renamed it.
They invaded in the 1930s and took it
31.
over.
Yep.
Yeah.
Under the League of Nations.
Under the League of Nations.
That, some people call that the first shot of the Second World War.
Some people do, because it was war. War was breaking out somewhere. After that, in 1935, the Italians invaded Tunisia.
No, wait a minute.
And in
Mussolini? Are you talking about
36
Mussolini?
Oh, Mussolini was an Italian, right? I
Yes.
said Italians. Okay, the Italian dictator, Mussolini, was involved in 1935. And then in 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. And that's your specialty,
That's right.
actually.
That's right.
Is the Spanish Civil War, and specifically the intervention that was made by Hitler,
Right.
in Germany, to aid Franco
Right.
to come to power.
That's right. As a satellite.
Yeah,
Franco was going to be a puppet of both Mussolini and Hitler.
that's what they thought. Now, Franco was a little more independent than that. He
Well,
managed to be.
Franco believed in the balance of power, and he says, I put some of my airplanes from Italy and some of them from Germany.
You mean
He ordered weapons
he ordered weapons from those countries?
from those two countries.
Sure.
Not all from the same
They had
country.
helped him come to power.
Right, right. But it was the Axis alliance.
Yes.
In other words, Mussolini invented the word Axis. The whole world revolves about the
Rome-Berlin axis.
Okay,
And of course, an axis is what holds the wheels together.
right. And Sardinia was an Italian island.
In the
And the
Mediterranean.
Balearic Islands, okay. So these islands were under dispute, okay. Some of them were French and some of them were Italian. And this goes back to the Napoleonic Wars.
Right, but the Balearic Islands themselves were supposedly Spanish.
Right,
The Spaniards control the Balearic Islands now.
Yeah, it's the Spanish,
And
the New Spain. The United.
one of the efforts in World War II was between those other islands that are north of the Balearics. One is called Sardinia.
That's the Italian island.
What's the other one? There's another one.
There's Minorca and Mallorca. The big island is Mallorca.
Yeah,
the little one
those
is
are in the
Minorca.
Balearics.
Those are Balearic Islands.
I can't remember what the one is that's north of Sardinia.
Sardinia is Italian.
Yes, but
Napoleon.
isn't there a
Napoleon
French island?
Bonaparte is an Italian pronunciation, or Napoleon Bonaparte is a French pronunciation.
Yeah,
They don't pronounce the E.
they don't pronounce the E, but the E on the end of French words makes the letter that came behind it mentioned. If it didn't have an E, it would be Bonaparte
Okay, fine.
instead of Bonaparte.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
So anyway, language, the Bible says, logos. The Bible had the word logos.
Logos.
That's an,
Logos is the Latin for word.
you have to have a language before you have a Bible. And
Yes, and before you have a Bible, which is either a book or in manuscript form.
Right, right.
Well,
What time you got now? You want to say more about Amali?
there were a number of other people who came to the Temple of Peace workshops on Friday, just a week ago today. So one of the best speakers, I thought, was Dr. Mary Nolan. She's retired from New York University.
Okay.
So she was the oldest panelist there, I would say, of all the people who spoke. She was someone who had been a academician for the longest time and is now retired from New York University. But she gave a very good summary of the time after World War II to more or less the present day, just moving right along and talking about the different important things that
Well,
happened.
O'Malley had a lot to say about the Congo.
Yes, about Africa and about the role of the United Nations
Right.
in the Congo.
And Dag
that's-
Hammarskjöld, okay?
He was the Dane who was the
Right.
head of the United Nations.
And the Swiss and the Swedes are part of the soft power who,
And the Danes probably too, because they have been neutral,
right.
neutral powers,
right.
have
Okay.
kept out of war.
Right.
And Dag Hammarskjöld was the United Nations Secretary General, who was died. He died in the Congo
That's correct.
because I think his plane was shot down.
That's right.
Anyway, there was a plane crash, and Dag Hammarskjöld, who had been, he wasn't the first Secretary General, but he was the main one from about 1950 until his death, which was in the late 50s, I think. The Temple of Peace
Was
picture
the UN.
shows
Yeah.
the United Nations as one of the pillars. And according to the picture, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the big alliance between the United States and Europe, especially the British. That's one of the other, although according to the poster, it's more of in a crumbling way, especially because of Mr.
The Europe,
Trump,
the Europe.
as you said.
No, not because of Trump, because of Europe, NATO.
But what I mean is the reason that they show the
Yeah.
NATO pillar sort of breaking up is because of Trump, I think, as you pointed out
But
earlier.
he doesn't know anything about the United Nations or NATO. He's trying to say that the British and French should put more money in NATO. And the
Yes.
United States is running a tariff race against NATO. And he's trying to get them to spend more money on their own defense.
Right.
Okay.
Their defense in cooperation with the United States
Okay.
through NATO.
Right. And Germany has the power to buy oil from Saudi Arabia or from Russia. Russia has plenty of oil to export. So oil is no shortage.
Oil was very.
It was thought to be a shortage.
Oil was a big factor in the Suez Crisis.
Yes.
Which we remember.
In
That was in
56.
1956.
Right.
And the British and French, who had originally built the canal 100 years earlier, tried to invade
All right.
Egypt.
Now with global warming and Bill Beale and our friends here say that we should keep all of the oil in the ground and use solar power and wind power.
Yes,
It's
indeed.
renewable.
Because the thing that happens with the burning of oil
It's
is
methane gas.
methane gas and other things that cause global warming,
Right. And hurricanes.
which was something we never even thought about in the days of Suez,
That's right.
global warming.
Technology, with the United States, technology works for medicine. The medical profession is got great progress, but moral progress is more difficult. That's very debatable. That's the fourth dimension: ideology, nationalism, communism, all of the isms. Watch out for the ideologies and isms.
Well, we remember the Suez Crisis because we were in England at the time in 1956.
Okay.
And oil was coming from Arabia through the Suez Canal.
Okay.
And after the Egyptians sank all those boats there
Right.
in the canal,
All right.
the oil had to go all the way down around the Cape of Good Hope, and the tip of Africa, in order to get to England. So gas was rationed in England in 1956. Now, we were lucky.
Yeah, you've emphasized that point many, many times, and I agree with you. Now, can you change the subject to Nehru? What's the importance of Nehru?
What's the importance of Nehru? Well,
Yes.
he was
From
the
India.
first prime minister of India, and he was a leader, along with Gandhi, in getting Indian independence from Britain.
Right.
Now, what did you want to say about Nehru? What
Well,
else?
Nehru contributed UN troops under the UN when Khrushchev was in power. And there were three dimensions: plutocracy, Soviet power, and public opinion. That was one of his contributions to the UN in the PM session, okay? And I think that came from O'Malley.
Well, that could very well be. She was one of the speakers.
And she had something positive to say in
the
soft
1
power
o'clock,
about O'Malley, okay?
The 1 o'clock workshop.
Yeah, all right. Now,
Well-
I would like to say something about the word hegemony.
Hegemony, okay.
That's soft power. Now, what's the difference between imperialism and hegemony?
You tell me.
Well, imperialism is the balance of power. You go out there with your fleet and with your navy and your army, and you invade other countries.
Well,
That's
hopefully
military.
that's the military.
That's hard power.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's hard power. That's not the balance of power.
Hegemony is a soft way of kind of talking about, in other words, the United States is the great hegemony. That's a polite way that the French use. Instead
of calling them
and
imperialist.
instead of calling the United States an imperial country.
Yeah.
Okay. But I know that through the Vietnam War, the United States was the leading empire and lost. It's the mirror image of World War II. The United States could win in Korea, but they could not win in Indochina. And there are only 2 minutes to go. Would you like to summarize now the main points you learned between soft power, imperialism, and hegemony?
No, I think you've done a pretty good job of describing that during our talk.
Okay.
Discussing the Temple of Peace ?
Okay.
And international cooperation on world order since 1945.
Okay.
With NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance that the U.S. has, and the international one. And we should remember, Bob, that due to decolonization since World War II, the United Nations, which started out with about 50 countries, is now up to 200.
That's right.
And the places that were held by European powers and the United States and a few others back in 1945 have become independent countries. The colonies have decolonized, and that's an important factor now in maintaining world order, realizing and recognizing the fact that this is such a big part of the years since 1945 decolonization. That was one of the things that I got from the conference was the importance of decolonization.
Okay. I think he's turned the TV off. Okay.
So we didn't have a chance to say, this is Bob and Lois signing off.
Okay. You can say that. You can say
Right. He says,
this is Athens Speakout.
this is Athens Speakout, Bob's program, and I've been his guest today and enjoyed going over those years.
Debate is the oxygen of democracy. That's my final word.
That is your final statement. Thanks very much, Bob.
Okay.